Hello, and welcome back to Merchant Bay. Now that the bridge is completed, we can begin building our way towards the back of the bay. In the last episode, I mentioned that the wolf and raven adornments on the bridge had given me an idea for our next project. Let's head over to the build site. For some time now, I've been collecting images meant to inspire design ideas. Some from real-life buildings, others from tabletop miniatures, and from floor plans meant to be used with Dungeons & Dragons. Loosely basing the front of the building on this image, minus the carriage house on the right, I had decided on a rather large 28 by 17 meter layout. With a build of this size, there was quite a bit of necessary terrain modification to do, including removing some trees and a few large rocks, as well as some leveling of the ground. After measuring and marking the border with log beams, I decided to see what kind of roof line I'd end up with for the rooms on either side of the entryway. If I were to be unhappy with the eventual roof line, it'd be better to make adjustments now, before the walls are built 2 stories high. Happy enough with the roof lines, I extended the rooms away from the log beam border, creating a recessed entryway between the 2 rooms. I flattened the terrain around the back and sides, and then made sure it was level with the underside of the log beams. But the terrain in front would be kept 1 meter lower. As usual, the NIMBYs were unhappy with how the neighborhood was changing and toddled over to voice their displeasure. Assuring them that the changes wouldn't affect them in the least, I pressed on with the build. The next step was to replace the log beams with stone. I decided to build the walls 1 block away from the border, creating a footing that provides the structure with a sense of endurance and strength. Following a detail from my inspirational image, I raised the stone blocks until they were 2 layers above the door, and I built a 10 by 4 meter entryway with some stairs, a single door, and some bench seating. When that was completed, I built a 2-story facade for one of the rooms. Even though I'm building a fantasy world inside of a fantasy game, I find myself inextricably tied to notions that are based in real-world fact. One such fact is that there was no such thing as an inn during the Viking era. That doesn't mean that I can't build an inn if I want to. But wherever I can find a way, I like to tilt the scales more towards a Viking style of building. But given the build pieces in Valheim, it's difficult to end up with an authentic-looking Viking-era building. So, Valheim Viking will have to do. I was unhappy with how this looked. The stone was too much, and it felt more like a mansion than an inn. I stayed away from the village for a few days. At some point I realized that the fact that there were no inns during the Viking era was probably the reason behind my dislike for this build so far. But I wasn't ready to tear it down just yet. I added some details, redesigned this window, and tested lowering the stone height on this wall by putting up some temporary log beams. If there was a structure in Merchant Bay meant to house visitors, it wouldn't be an inn as we know it. It would have to be something more Viking. One thing I love about building Merchant Bay is that it has inspired me to create a history of the people that established this place. At times, what I am building inspires the lore that I'm writing, and at other times, the lore of the land inspires what I build. And sometimes, like this time, it's a mixture of both things at once. Although I had avoided the build for a while by not logging into the game, my desire to save it and make it work never faded. After several days away from it, I had an idea. One that would not only save the build, but also contribute to the lore. In fact, it would be the most important part of any collection of lore, the beginning. Initially, I had a simple idea that would allow me to preserve my existing build and expand it in a way that would fulfill my desire for a more Viking-style structure. But this idea soon took on a life of its own and grew into a short story, which then became a much longer story. 10,000 words later, I had written something I never intended, featuring characters I hadn't anticipated, all part of a journey that carried me along with it, creating for me the sense of being both the captain and a passenger of my own story. In the end, the events of that story will lead us back to this build. But let us leave it for now, and allow me to present to you the founding of Merchant Bay. One day, when the settlers of Merchant Bay were still traveling aboard their ships, searching for that perfect place to call home, they caught sight of a coastal village. In need of supplies, they made their way to the shore to trade with the locals. As you may already know from previous Merchant Bay episodes, the people who would go on to found Merchant Bay were of two different clans. But these were not clans in the familial sense. The members of each clan did not all share a common descent. Instead, each one was comprised of many different families. What united them was their passion for craftsmanship and artistry, and many among them were highly skilled artisans. You may also remember that one of these clans flew the white banner, and the other the red. What you do not yet know are the names of these clans, but you will soon understand why that is important to the story. Upon reaching the shore, the would-be settlers disembarked their ships and scattered into the village in search of a marketplace or any person or persons that they could interest in a trade. And in this pursuit they would not be disappointed. In a few hours they would trade some of their coin, and in some cases their handiwork, for food and whatever other items each had felt a need for. The leaders of these two clans, Gare and Fisker, were very good friends, and they soon found themselves walking alone together. Instead of passing through the village as the others had done, they walked along the shore, then through the fields around the village, keeping it always in their sight. They passed the time speaking of such things as leaders are wont to speak of: governance and security, production and trade, lumber camps and shipbuilding, blacksmithing and mining operations, farming and hunting and gathering. Each man would often turn his gaze toward the village as they discussed the future of their own. Their first and foremost concern, however, was to discover the perfect place to establish their settlement, one that would meet all of their needs. Until then, all other hopes and dreams would have to wait. The two were so engrossed in conversation that they had hardly noticed the passing of the time. Soon the sun would begin to set. "It is getting late, and we have spent no time trading," Fisker said. "We had better get back to the ships." "And we are going back without any food in our bags. Hopefully someone will feed us," joked Gare. Always in the mood to trade jests, Fisker looked at him and said, "By the ever-shrinking ability of your belt to keep your tunic closed, you would not be harmed in missing a meal." "Yes," returned Gare, "but the grumbling of my stomach would keep the others awake. Besides," he added, with a mixture of both real and exaggerated pride, "most of this is muscle." On their way back to the camp, they decided this time to pass through the village. The streets were mostly quiet and dimly lit by the soft glow of cooking fires casting light through open windows and open doors. Soon the smell of cooked meat would mingle with that of the smoke. As they neared the center of the village, they could see the masts of their ships that were moored along the coast. And when they had traveled nearly all the way through and out the other side, they were met by a man and a woman standing in the doorway of their home. "Are you two a party to the visitors that have come today to trade?" asked the man. "Indeed," said Gare. "We are the heads of those two clans." "Ah, I am Raffen, and this is my wife Ylva. Perhaps we can interest you in trade?" Gare and Fisker looked at each other with mild surprise. "What is that you said?" asked Gare. "Perhaps we could interest you in trade," Raffen said. "No," said Fisker. "Your names." "I am Raffen," the man repeated, "and this is Ylva. You see, these names mean raven and wolf, Since the clans did not have a single family name to represent them, each one chose a new name to align themselves with. The White Clan, led by Fisker, chose Hrafn, meaning raven, while the Red Clan, led by Geir, chose Ulfr, which, like Ylva, means wolf. These names were not uncommon, but it struck both Geir and Fisker as a curious coincidence. "We were meant to come and barter for food," said Fisker, "as our supplies have run low." "And we tire of fish," added Geir. Although the couple would not have understood, even if they had noticed, a wry smile flashed across Geir's face as his eyes darted quickly to Fisker and back again. You would have thought that Fisker had not noticed either, but indeed he had noticed. You see, the name Fisker means fish, and tiring of fish was a well-used joke that Geir had repeated many times over many years. So many times, in fact, that the joke had become a sort of game where one man did the telling and the other pretended not to notice. One of Geir's favorite tactics was to tell it unexpectedly in the presence of others, in the hope of catching Fisker off his guard and making him laugh, upon which point Geir would look at him quizzically as if he had no idea why his friend was laughing. On one particular occasion, Geir had succeeded in making Fisker laugh in front of Liv, the clothier's daughter, when first the two had met. Embarrassed by his laughing for seemingly no reason, Fisker explained to Liv that his friend was very fond of a tired old joke. Liv playfully admonished him, musing aloud that perhaps the joke was not as tired as he made it out to be, if he still laughed at hearing it. When Liv had left them to get back to her sewing, Fisker was left feeling somewhat ashamed for having exposed his friend as the reason for his odd behavior, instead of suffering the loss of the game unto himself. Not sure what he would say, he began to piece together an apology for his lack of honor. But as soon as he opened his mouth to speak, Geir burst out laughing. He had known by the blush on Fisker's face that it was love at first sight. He laughed until his stomach hurt at the way Fisker had lowered his head and suddenly did not seem to know what to do with his hands, clumsily explaining the joke to her. Geir thought all of this was the funniest thing he had ever seen, and he laughed and laughed until, finally, he had to sit down right there on the ground. He had not laughed at Fisker for falling in love. He laughed because Fisker was a great man, a strong and courageous man, and a great leader of other strong and courageous men and women. To see all of that strength and courage suddenly become of no use whatsoever was too much for Geir. Fisker quickly glanced in the direction that Liv had gone, but she was now out of sight. He wanted to laugh as well, but he took the moment as an exercise in keeping his composure. He had been defeated this round and needed to regain some standing. He stood expressionless, looking down at Geir sitting there, his laughter dying down and starting up again in waves. Exhausted, Geir leaned back on his elbows, then stretched out on the ground. Lying there in the dirt, he looked as if he had already done a hard day's work and was ready for bed. Only when it seemed that his laughter had finally played itself out did he attempt to stand up again, something that always gave him trouble due to his size and his muscular stomach. "I should leave you there," Fisker said, smiling a small smile. Geir handed him a defeat in front of Liv, but he had now unwittingly handed Fisker this victory in trade. Fisker reached out a hand to help his friend up from the ground. That was long ago. This time, in front of Hrafn and Ylva, Fisker played his part so convincingly that Geir wondered if he had not really heard him after all. "What sort of foodstuff do you have?" asked Fisker. "We have no food to trade," Ylva replied. "We craft tools and other useful things." Hrafn reached a hand inside the doorway and produced a glass globe that was half filled with water. It was not a small thing, yet it could easily be held in one hand. Encircling the glass globe were two bands of braided metal, one of copper and one of silver, which intersected at right angles, dividing the globe into quadrants. Floating upon the water was a wooden disc, highly polished and decorated with runes around its circumference and with lines radiating from its center. "It is a compass," said Hrafn, "but unlike any that you have ever seen," he said, stepping out of the house to allow them a better look. "The floating disc will always point the way to the pole star." Neither man would have understood, but there was a lodestone embedded into the wooden disc. Hrafn was happy to keep this secret for himself. He demonstrated proof of his compass by walking around them in a circle, all the while facing them and with the globe held up high for them to see. He went around them in a clockwise fashion, and as he went, they turned with him to keep their eyes on it. No matter which direction Hraven and the glass globe faced, the wooden disc floating upon the water always pointed north. "We have sun compasses," said Ger. "It is a handsome piece to be sure, but we have no need for it." "What do you do when the sun does not shine?" asked Hraven. "We have always managed," Ger replied. But Hraven's point was well taken. A sun compass was only useful if there was enough sunlight to cast a shadow. The men were intrigued, and there was no denying that the glass ball compass was beautifully made. The globe appeared to be a perfect sphere of perfectly clear glass. There was no sign of a pontil mark, and the surface was perfectly smooth, containing not the smallest bubble, and showing no signs of having been blown into a mold. Truly it was a wonder. "Hraven creates beautiful objects," said Ylva. "This is my newest creation." She stepped back from the doorway momentarily, and returned with what at first glance looked like a short staff, or an oversized, ornate scepter. At closer inspection, it turned out to be a bronze horn, crafted into an elongated S-shape. Unlike traditional horns with a single bell to project and amplify sound, this one had two. The larger bell was shaped like a bear's head with its mouth open, while the smaller one, situated just below and in front of the first, resembled an open-mouthed fish, as if it had leapt out of the water to escape the jaws of the bear. Both the bear and fish bells were adorned with polished red garnet and carnelian. The long length of bronze tubing was wrapped with red and white jute, fully red at one end and fully white at the other. As each whipping of color spiraled toward the center, it began to be interwoven and braided together with its opposite. Red slowly gave way to white, as white gave way to red, until, in the center, each color was represented in equal measure. "It is a horn," said Ylva. "The finest horn indeed," added Hraven. "And the loudest." Ylva raised up the horn with both hands and, although she did not blow into it, demonstrated its use. Placing the mouthpiece near her lips, she puffed out her cheeks and tilted her head back slightly, pretending to sound the horn. The bear and fish bells stood at least a full meter above her head. She lowered the horn and laughed gently at her own pretending. "That is a horn like no other I have ever seen," said Fisker. "Nor I," added Ger. "But we have no need for such a thing. We have plenty of horns. It is getting late, and we must depart early in the morning." "Well then, we wish you a safe voyage home," Ylva said, as the men continued on their way. If it had not grown dark, and if the men were not hungry for their dinner, they may have explained to the couple that they did not yet know where home was, and that the reason for their voyage was first to discover that place, and then, once discovered, to settle the land they found there and make it their home. But it was dark, and they were hungry, so they had said nothing more. The next day announced its arrival not in pale blue as was expected, but in tones of bronze, red, and yellow. The clouds were thin and few, however, and the wind was favorable. If a storm was coming, they should be able to stay ahead of it. These would-be settlers were artisans, but they were also warriors and hunters, builders and sailors. To voyage on rough seas was never preferable, but neither would it hinder their departure. The clans were gathered on the shore in two groups. Ger and Fisker were each taking a head count of their members to make sure all were present and accounted for before anyone boarded the ships. Fisker noticed two figures coming towards them from the village. It was Hraven and Ylva. Still some distance away, Hraven waved a friendly hello. He carried a bag across each shoulder, and Ylva carried a long leather case. Judging by its size and shape, Fisker recognized that the case must contain Ylva's horn. He returned a wave. Ger, having just finished his head count, looked to see who Fisker was waving at. Expecting that the two had come to attempt a last-minute trade of the compass and the horn, the men waited patiently for them to draw near. It was Ylva who spoke first. "We have come to ask something of you," she said. The two men were in no mood to further discuss the compass and the horn. If they were to stay ahead of the storm, they needed to get under way. "We have heard only this morning that you are artisans and that you are seeking a new land," said Hraven. "We wish to be counted among you, if you would have us." Ger was surprised by this unexpected request. Though the couple were not elderly, they were older. That they would leave their home and village behind and entrust their well-being to a group of strangers seemed odd. "Would you be so rash as to choose to be homeless in an instant?" he asked them. "To leave here is a decision that we made some time ago," said Raven. "We have been selling our handicraft in preparation to set off. All that remained were the compass and the horn. Had you chosen to buy them, we would be leaving here on foot, headed to wherever fate would take us." Having seen for themselves the compass and the horn, the two leaders knew that the couple were highly skilled. They would fit in well with the clans. "You may come with us," said Fisker, "and as payment for your passage and accommodations, we very well may have the use of your compass and horn at no loss of coin to ourselves," he added, trying to make them feel at once welcome and useful. As they now had guests among them, Gare decided he should sail with Fisker and their two new companions. Fisker's ship would lead, followed by Alvar's ship. Gare's ship would come third, captained by Alvis, the eldest among them, and Alvis's son Haldor would pilot the vessel. While the clans had left their homes behind, they had not left their homeland. Their ships were not crossing oceans, but exploring the coasts of the mainland and those of the many thousands of islands in the area. They knew the geographical features of these coastal lands very well, and were confident that they would eventually find what they were looking for. They had been sailing for weeks now, searching for a very particular kind of place, one with a natural inlet from the sea. If they hoped to establish a successful trade village, they would need a place that offered safe harbor for ships, and the surrounding land would need to be rich in resources. Since the day they set out, their lives had become little more than sailing and searching. This day's sailing had begun with signs of a slow-moving storm. All morning the travelers had been using this to their advantage, allowing the steady winds to carry them quickly over the seas. As the day wore on, the thin, wispy clouds thickened and grew increasingly dark, and the wind, which was initially fortunate, had now become perilous. "Shorten the sail!" yelled Fisker. Waves were now splashing over the sides of the ship. Several people were lifting up the removable deck planks to begin bailing out the water that had been collecting below. Fisker's order had not been heard, and so he shouted again to adjust the sail. Ivar got to work on the sail, while Gare made his way to join Fisker at the steering oar of the ship. "It has caught up to us now!" Fisker yelled over the sound of the wind strumming against the sails. "And suddenly!" As he spoke, he began to steer the ship toward the mainland. "I am taking us to shore now before the heavy rains begin. We have already taken on enough water from these waves." "The fish in my boots have told me as much already, my friend," Gare said, smiling, seeming to enjoy the spray and rough seas. "And they will swim next in my cooking pot once you get us safely ashore." "Then you are not as tired of fish as you let on?" asked Fisker, feigning deep contemplation. Gare turned to look back at the ships behind them, and marveled at how a distant ship in rough seas could appear to be moving slower than time should allow, seeming as if it was only gently rocked on the waves like a baby in its crib, while at the same time the ship you were on was moving faster, lifting and crashing on those same waves. And though the distant ship seemed somehow safe, you knew that any moment could bring disaster for either vessel. Gare's musing about ships was interrupted when he thought of a funny retort to Fisker's question about fish. He turned back around smiling. Suddenly, a great gust of wind cut across them from the direction of the mainland, nearly capsizing them as the sail struggled to comply with the demands of the changing wind. The ship tipped far starboard, and everyone on board was tumbled with it. Everyone except Gare. He was a barrel-chested man, capable and strong, but he was just round enough that finding himself flat on the deck would cause him some embarrassment in getting back up again, and even more so on a rain-soaked deck. At the first indication of the gust's effect on the ship, he set a wide stance, lowered his center of gravity, and outstretched his arms. He slid on the wet deck, but kept to his feet, even as he watched everyone on board tumble. Mercifully, no one was lost overboard. Fisker, however, was slammed into the steering oar, and as the ship recoiled back toward port side, he reached out for the oar to keep from falling. But his hand slipped free, and he fell onto his back and slid right past Gare to the opposite side of the boat, hitting his head on the port gunwale. He scrambled to get back to the oar just as the heavens let loose a torrent of rain. "The withy broke! The steering oar is lost!" he yelled out to no one in particular. "By Njord!" "And Thor," he added, as lightning and thunder stretched out over the sea. "Someone does not want us on solid ground just yet." But Geir made no reply. Seeing that Fisker had stood up again under his own power, his attention had turned behind them once again, and just in time to see the second ship fade into a singular, muted purple veil that, just a moment sooner, had been both sea and sky. In the confusion and growing darkness, they lost sight of the island coast they had been following. Realizing that they had lost their only safe refuge and were now sailing aimlessly through the dark, fear began to set in. "I cannot see the shore," said Fisker over the wind and waves, "and I am not sure of our heading. Njord has claimed the oar for himself, and he takes us where he wills."
"Knowing our heading does us little good without the ability to change course," said
Geir, the wind pushing rain-soaked hair across his face.
"And we have no way of knowing if the others have changed course with us."
Geir recalled Hrafn's compass, and as if on cue, here was Hrafn, already making his way carefully to the stern of the ship. "If I may, Captain, we are now headed directly west." He handed his compass to Fisker. The weight of it felt good in his hand. He realized now that there was more of substance to the two braided metal bands than just their intricate beauty. They helped to seat the compass in the hand, and their textured surface provided a tactile grip around the glass globe. Fisker felt certain that he could rotate his wrist to suspend the compass over the deck without fear of dropping it. Even in the mists of the storm, the rainwater beaded and rolled off the smooth, polished glass. He stood there, almost spellbound, when he thought he heard the faintest sound of a horn on the wind. Their use of horns was primarily for hunting, and their signals were simple, conveying only general information. There was a ceremonial signal to mark the beginning of the hunt, and another to announce the end of a day's hunt. There was a signal to announce the discovery of prey and to flush it out from hiding, and another to indicate that prey had been lost. And one signal in particular meant that someone had suffered a misfortune and that they required assistance. This signal was the first one taught to a young person. They would need to master it before they were permitted to go on a hunt. Though the sound Fisker heard was nothing more than the howling of the wind, it gave him an idea. "It may do us good after all," he said. "We cannot know if the others saw how the wind changed our course, but we can let them know what course we are on." Hrafn had returned before they even realized he was gone, and with him he carried Ylva's horn. Fisker looked at Geir triumphantly, while Geir stared back at him, not having any idea what he was grinning about. Fisker said nothing, but began to sing aloud an old and very well-known verse. "And so I go a-sailing, a westward wind prevailing, carrying me as I roam. West, west, west I go, west to hearth and home." As he sang the words, "West, west, west," he pointed toward the bow of the ship in the direction they were going, and his idea was made clear. Though Geir now understood Fisker's plan, those who could not hear their conversation must have wondered if he had gone mad, a water-soaked captain singing on board an oarless ship while it traveled at the mercy of the wind and waves.
"Can any horn be heard over this storm?"
Geir asked. Having taken the horn out of the case, Hrafn said nothing more, but stood holding the horn with an outstretched arm. "That barrel you attempt to hide in your tunic should be right for the job," said Fisker. He turned and stared at the broken piece of rope that used to have a steering oar attached to it. Geir held the horn aloft and tested the mouthpiece with his lips. He first tried the signal that meant aid was required, a low note, followed by its upper octave, followed by the low note again. The horn was loud, very loud, like no other, he thought. He found the notes easy to control, as if he knew the horn well. He smiled, took a breath, and then tried the aid signal again, this time producing an even louder sound than before. Many on board were astonished at the clarity of the horn, and for a moment forgot the peril they were in. But the horn did nothing to assuage their confusion. First, Fisker had broken out into song, and now Geir was blowing hunting signals on the strangest-looking horn any of them had ever seen. Encouraged by what he now knew the horn could do, Geir moved to the back of the ship, braced himself against the sternpost, and began to repeat the melody of The Song of the Sea Roamer. When he had finished, he played the distress signal again, paused, and then played the song's melody again. As the rain continued to fall, he repeated these two melodies over and over, while the others braved the storm as best they could. Some clung on for dear life to the ship or to each other. Others continued to bail out the water, and all on board were carried relentlessly westward, towards an unknown destination. Fisker knew their troubles were far from over. At any moment the unpredictable winds could shift and alter the ship's direction. They had already signaled to the others that they were headed west, but had the message been received, and if so, would they understand its meaning? He thought of every song he knew, and regretted not remembering any that mentioned the other compass points. It was useless. They must keep the ship on a westward heading, in the hope that help will reach them. Perhaps a replacement oar can be fashioned from something on board, thought Fisker to himself. One of the removable deck planks from midship would be long enough. After a quick trim with the axe to narrow the upper end, the axe, with its blade lashed to the flat of that narrowed end, would create the perfect handle for steering. It could work. He had to try. He made his way to midship to lift out one of the deck planks. Several others had already been removed from both halves of the ship, so that water could be bailed out of the hull, but the planks at midship were the longest. He stepped past shivering, rain-soaked people and over planks and benches. He checked Roffin's compass once again. They were still headed west. This, at least, was good news, all things considered. The bench closest to the mast was crowded. There was room enough at the starboard side for him to step onto the bench and pass the woman seated there. Once at the mast, he would be able to remove one of the planks. Though Gare had stopped playing, Fisker could still hear the melody of the horn in his mind. West, west, west I go. Fisker was left holding the compass. He would need both hands free to lift and carry the plank back to where he could work it. Having no bag or pockets, he looked to Roffin, seeking to hand the compass back to him. Roffin rose to meet him. As Fisker began to step onto the bench, the woman seated there leaned to the right, placing her hand flat on the bench directly under where his foot was about to land. He quickly moved to place his foot on the starboard gunwale in order to avoid stepping on her hand. He lost his balance, or perhaps his foot had slipped on the wet gunwale. How exactly it happened mattered little to him in the icy cold waters of the rough sea. And there on the waves, like a bobber on a fishing line, the compass marked the place where he had sunk.
"We have lost sight of Fisker's ship,"
Alvis said to his son.
"It was there, a dim silhouette against the sky, and then in a moment it was gone."
"The sea and the sky appear to have become one," said Haldor. "We may soon lose sight of Alfr's ship next. What shall we do?" Haldor had his own ideas of what to do, but Alvis was both his father and captain on this voyage. He would obey his commands and keep his own thoughts on the matter to himself. Alvis was angry that they found themselves caught in this storm. By his judgment, they should have made their way to land an hour before the storm caught up to them. They had already covered a remarkable distance sailing with the winds that the gust front had provided. There was no reason to take a gamble. Fisker, however, liked to push his luck, but only in small ways, just enough to give himself an edge towards some insignificant advantage, and never in a way that resulted in any true danger, until now. But what advantage could he gain by needlessly racing a storm? When the storm had worsened, Alvis feared that some among them could be swept overboard. He gave orders to remove some of the deck planking so that women and children could be seated lower in the hull. As there was no safe way to quickly secure the planking, the boards that were removed were thrown overboard. Everyone else sat as securely as they could, holding on to benches, the mast, or any other solid piece of ship near at hand. By now, everyone on board was soaked to the bone. Those seated on benches were no less wet than the women and children sitting in the hull's deepening pool of water. The cold wind had been uncomfortable, but with the added heavy rain, the lives of everyone on board all three ships were now in grave danger. Alvis would decide to head east towards the coast they had recently lost sight of. But this too was a gamble. The many islands in this area were of all shapes and sizes. They could head east only to discover that they had already passed the island they expected to find there. Every possible remedy they could take was equally likely to cause disaster as it was to save them. Alvis turned to his son, but before he could speak, "Did you hear that?" asked Haldor.
Hear what?
Asked Alvis. A horn. I think it was a horn.
A horn? Are we hunting whales?
They signal for aid, said Haldor.
Aid?
Replied his father.
We are in no position to give aid to anyone. Take us east towards the island. We cannot risk being in this storm any longer.
Haldor did as his father commanded and changed course for the eastern island. But the horn had played more than just a signal for aid. The fragment of melody he was able to hear over the storm seemed familiar to him, but he could not place it. At the prow of the ship, a man named Arn was shouting something to Haldor and pointing at him, but he could not hear what he was saying. The icy water was painful. It always was at first, but he had learned to master it over time. Why was he not its master now? Why could he not move? Why could he only sink deeper into the sea? This plunge was unexpected. He had no time to prepare. Perhaps he could will his body to move. What good would that do? His ship could not turn back to retrieve him. They could use the anchor. What if they did not see him fall overboard? Even with its sails furled, the wind was pushing the ship west, 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 west to hearth and home. He thought of his old home and hearth. He thought of the day she had left him for the underworld. No, it was wrong of him to think she left him. He knew better than that. It was not her choice to go. She had been very ill, and no medicine could cure her. And what would turn out to be the last hours that they would have left together in this world? They talked of their future in the land that the clans would discover. The decision to go had already been made by then, but it would be a year before their ships set sail in search of the new land. They talked of the house he would build for them, of the dresses and tunics she would sew for the market, of the children they would have. She only needed to get well again. Something was touching his foot. She always wore the most beautiful dresses, he thought, as he took a seat in the sand. Beautiful dresses, especially that yellow one. It took her so long to make that yellow one. He wondered why. And then, as he lay there with the sea floor for his pillow, he remembered that it was her wedding dress. He should sleep now and dream.
No,
he heard her say.
You promised. Man overboard!
Someone shouted. Ger was witness to it all. Fisker reading the compass. Fisker looking for Raffen. Raffen standing up to meet him. Fisker moving to step over the bench. The woman leaning. Fisker moving his foot so as not to step on her, and then Fisker falling over the gunwale. The scene unfolded before him like part of a once well-known saga, now half forgotten. As each piece of the drama was revealed, he seemed, almost, to know what was going to happen next. If he could somehow get ahead of what he was seeing, he would know what to do. He stood frozen in time, aware but unable to stop the tragedy that was playing out before him. Ger made his way to the starboard gunwale. There was no sign of him.
Fisker!
He shouted.
Fisker!
He went to the anchor and heaved it overboard. Instinctively he turned towards the steering oar, momentarily forgetting that it was gone. As he stood staring, not knowing what to do next, the sound of the anchor rope slipping off the deck came to an unexpected halt.
Shallow water!
He yelled over the wind and rain. Grabbing the anchor rope, he quickly tied it off. With the anchor rope secured, he turned and looked in every direction but could see nothing through the purple veil. Although the anchor was on the sea floor, the wind continued to push the ship slowly westward. A man seated at the foremost bench made his way to the prow post to keep an eye out for dangers. Shallow water could be a blessing or a curse. They may soon be safe on land, or the gods may deliver them another disaster to endure. It was not uncommon to find a shore either partially or entirely blocked off from ships due to large numbers of rocks protruding above the waves. Even more dangerous than these were the rocks just below the surface. They could capsize a vessel or burst open its hull before you even knew they were there.
Land!
Yelled the man from the prow post.
Land straight ahead!
Ger looked back toward the place where Fisker had gone overboard. His half-potent foresight now gone, he found himself able to act and make decisions again. He could not risk losing another life. He motioned to the nearest man to help him pull up the anchor. As he began to pull on the rope, a sudden, desperate rush of adrenaline flashed like fire in his chest. Gare pulled furiously at the anchor rope as the other man coiled the slack. He would pull in the rope, and Fisker, who had taken hold of it from under the sea, would come up with it. But even before the anchor reached the surface, he knew that Fisker would not be there. With the anchor secured, the ship began to pick up speed. Standing at the stern, his back to the west, Gare watched as the place where Fisker had fallen into the sea disappeared behind the veil. The floating compass marked the place where he went down below the waves, and it also marked the place where he came up again, gasping for air. In a flash of lightning, he saw the glass and braided metal bands of the compass reflecting the light from the sky. He swam towards it. He had to have it. It would guide him westward. It was not a long rise from the sea floor. He could not be very far from land. Reaching the compass, he found that it was too dark to read it. He treaded water, waiting for Thor to strike his hammer again, but this was made difficult with the compass in his hand. He floated on his back, trying to see the lines and runes on the disk. This too was difficult, as he was above the waves one moment and under them the next. Hurry, he thought. He would surely die from the cold if he stayed too long waiting. Crack! A gift from the god. That way! He faced himself westward in the water. He had no bag tied to his belt, nor any pockets in his clothing. Keeping hold of the compass would slow him down. He had to let it go. What a shame to lose such a treasure. He let it go and started to swim. He swam with the waves towards the land that he hoped would be there. With every flash of lightning, he strained his eyes to see any sign of the coast. Nothing more than an ice bath, he told himself as he struggled forward. But this was more than an ice bath, and he had been in it for too long. Despite his best efforts, his movements slowed and his eyes closed. As the sun rose, the people were huddled around a dozen different campfires. Few of them, mostly the children, were lucky enough to have slept. Although the rain had stopped some hours ago, the sea had yet to regain its usual rhythm. Fisker's ship was beached, having been pushed by the wind until it could be pushed no further. Alphar's ship was anchored nearby, but Gare's own ship had not been sighted. With the rising of the sun, the purple veil had turned a dark gray, and the sea and sky became separate entities once again. As the sun rose higher and higher, the gray dome above them became more and more pale. Gare sat some distance away, watching the others. There was Ivar, retrieving supplies from Alphar's ship. Alpha and someone else, whom Gare could not identify, were gathering kindling from under the nearby trees. Most of the others were huddled together at the fires, an eerie mist of steam rising from their bodies. In the midst of them all were Hrafn and Ylva, bringing food and water, tending to injuries, and exchanging wet blankets and clothes for those that were newly dried. Gare found himself entertaining an intrusive thought, one that asked him to weigh the loss of Fisker against the gain of the newcomers. Why should I think such things? He thought. One had nothing to do with the other. He knew that. A gain for a loss does not always even the balance. Despite knowing such things, the mind will still search for reason and order to make sense of nonsensical things. He looked up from the sand where he was sitting to see Ylva standing motionless among the others, like a boat on still waters. She was looking at him. She stood not moving for just a moment, with the smallest of smiles, the kind that says, I understand. When she had turned her attention back to the others, Gare stood up to move further down shore. He did not want to be seen, and he did not need to be understood. He had walked only a short distance when something caught his eye. There it is, he said. There, out on the ocean, was his ship. Though it was still far away, it seemed to be whole. He could see from the sail that the ship was changing course, and was now headed north of them instead of to the other ships. Gare shouted for Ivar, one of the White Clan, and motioned for him to follow. Ivar called to two others to join him. Gare did not wait, but continued walking on without them. But seeing the ship for themselves, the other three began to run and soon caught up to him. The four of them headed along the shore to meet the ship where they expected it to come in. Based on the ship's course, it would be a long walk before they met with it. "Why do they not come to us?" Ivar asked, once he had fully understood the circumstances. "Surely they see the ships." "I do not know," said Geir. As they walked, the sun began to break through the clouds, and they each were glad for its warmth. Geir was uncommonly quiet as they walked, but there was no mystery as to why. The loss of the leader of the White Clan was a tragedy that they would not easily rise above, and until the White Clan chose a new leader, the responsibility for all of them fell to Geir. Although he was perfectly capable of leading them all, he had never expected to have to do so. After all that he and Fisker had worked towards, it was not fair that only he should be the one to see their dream come true. If only they had stayed at the village and let the storm pass, this would not have happened. Fisker should have turned for shore sooner, but that was not his way. He was always the last one to sleep and the first one to wake, the first one to the hunt and the last one to eat. Always, it seemed, trying to prove something. He should not have pushed their luck. Geir halted for a moment, lifting a hand to shade his eyes and turning his head away from the sea. For an instant, the sunlight on the waves had blinded him. The four walked on in silence. They could see ahead of them that the shoreline was curving around to the north. Geir looked out to sea at his ship still making its way. Seeing that it too was headed for the curving coast, he decided to head inland, cutting across the woods to reach the shore on the other side, rather than taking the longer route along the beach. Blinded again. "The sun is insufferable," he said, shielding his eyes once again. Suddenly he stopped walking, and so the others stopped. Looking again, he realized that this last reflection was different. It was not coming from the water, but from the beach. There was something else, too. He started towards it and soon broke into a run. His three companions looked at each other and then ran after him. Geir ran all the way to the water's edge. "Help!" he yelled as he got close, never taking his eyes from what he saw. He bent down low and scooped him up from the wet sand in an instant. "Fisker!" In the days that followed, there was much to do, but Geir had often come to Fisker and to Ylva and Raven who were caring for him. Raven had made a lean-to shelter of pine boughs, and Ylva fashioned a deep bed of dried grasses for Fisker to rest upon. They covered him in furs and blankets. A campfire burned in front of the shelter, which was never allowed to go out. He was alive, but remained unresponsive. As the sun went down on their second day, Geir returned to them. "How is he today?" he asked. "He still sleeps," Ylva said. "I have never seen him asleep before," Geir said, trying to sound cheerful. "He was always the last to sleep and the first to wake up again." "Sleep heals us all," Ylva said. "You also need your rest." Geir was reminded of his mother and of his boyhood days. But unlike then, he would not argue the point. They were older than he was, Raven and Ylva, yet they had the heart and energy of the young. Since the ship had run aground on the beach, the two of them were constantly doing for others. Even from the moment they boarded Fisker's ship, they had made themselves useful. Geir was glad that at least one of them was always here, watching over him. He sat back against the trunk of a fallen tree, the campfire between him and Fisker's shelter, and he slept a dreamless sleep. She had always been beautiful, but this day, surely she had never been more beautiful than this day. The yellow dress bestowed upon her an almost magical radiance. The sun itself was drawn to her, and peeked through the branches and the leaves, only to dart away in shame, embarrassed to have compared its light to hers. Then here it came to look again, unable to resist. She had made the dress over many days, every cut and stitch with her own hands. She made it alone where no one could see, and she kept it hidden. It had been imbued with love and a meticulous skill, and it was perfect. She had made it perfect, and in turn it had made her perfect. They were perfect together. They were perfect together, and they would be together always. They would be together always, 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 always. Fisker opened his eyes. He could hear his own heart pounding in his chest. For a moment he forgot the voyage and all that had happened. He closed his eyes again, and a surprising flood of tears streaked down both sides of his face. He did not wipe them away, but lay there not moving, staring up at the pine boughs overhead through a blur of pooled tears. He imagined he was lying in a coffin and would soon be carried away. He would not mind. He refused to move. If he moved, he would know for sure. Only the living can move. "It is good to have you back again, Captain," a voice said. "You have been gone a long time, and we feared you had lost your way." He recognized Rothan's voice. "How long have I been gone?" he asked. 3 full days, was the reply. Still, he did not move. He lay there watching the sunlight peeking through the green leaves of the trees. "I am sorry," said Fisker. Rothan waited for him to continue, but he did not. "For what are you sorry?" Rothan asked. "I am sorry," he said again, as if he had not heard himself the first time. "I have lost your compass. As soon as I fell into the icy sea, I could not move, and knew for sure that I would die. A weight that I carried dragged me down to the bottom, and in despair, I accepted my failure and my death." He paused a moment, still watching the sunlight as it came and went through the leaves. "But then, what had become a weight to sink me became the strength to raise me up again. When I reached the surface, there was the compass. I waited for the light of Mjolnir by which to read it. After what seemed an eternity, the hammer struck, and knowing which way to go, I had to hurry. I had to leave it behind." "The loss of the compass is of little importance," said Rothan. "It showed us what course the wind had forced upon us, enabling us to signal the others. When you were lost without a ship to carry you, it showed you which way to turn. And if you did not take it with you, then it must have followed you here. I am told it was next to you on the shore. The light of the sun reflected off its surface, and it was seen by Gare, who found you. So the compass is not lost after all. In their haste to get you to camp, the compass was left behind. They soon went back to find where Gare's ship had gone. When they came to the place where they found you, the compass was gone." Fisker said nothing. He reached slowly above his head and snapped off a twig of pine needles from the dry boughs above him. "All are present and accounted for," Rothan assured Fisker. "Gare says that we have found the place you were looking for, and he cannot wait to show it to you. He is sure you will agree, but wants to know your word. He cannot make this decision without you. Rest and grow strong again. There is much work to do." Rothan began to prepare the morning meal. He placed a large cooking pot over the fire and filled it with water. Removing the meat that was roasting over the flames, he cut it into pieces and added it to the pot. There was nothing left for him to do now but to wait for Ylva to return with more ingredients for the soup. Returning to camp along the trail of trampled grass, Ylva's basket was filled with various mushrooms, edible greens, and 2 varieties of berries, which had since found their way to the bottom of the basket. She regretted not having any pine bark flour to make berry bread or berry cakes for dessert. "They will have to be eaten plain," she thought. Plain berries could be tart, but there were much worse culinary fates than tart berries. She stopped a moment and reached down past the mushrooms and greens to find one. "He is awake," Rothan said. Intent on finding and sampling a berry, Ylva had not heard him coming down the trail to meet her. "Only just now," he added. She looked up the trail toward their meager camp. There was Fisker, sitting up on the bed of dried grass. Cautiously, he stood himself up. His bed had seemed a coffin to him, but now he thought it like a lonely ship, disembarked of its only passenger. He tested his land legs and felt the earth beneath his bare feet. Looking up, he saw Ylva and Rothan on the trail. He stood waiting for them to draw near. When they arrived, he spoke first. "I will have something to eat," he said. "Then I will find Gare." Before either of them could protest, he looked at Rothan and said, "There is much work to do." Rothan straightened slightly, disarmed at hearing his own words spoken back to him. Ylva, ever aware of things both said and unsaid, decided also not to argue the point. She gave him a few berries to accustom his stomach to food again, then turned to prepare the mushrooms and vegetables for the cooking pot. Fisker had only a single bowl of the soup. He was hungry enough for several bowls, but what he wanted more than food was to get to his ship. Walking through the woods towards the shore, he saw the masts of 2 ships. He looked left and right, searching between the tall tree trunks for the third, but he could see no sign of it. Though it was only morning, the sand felt hot under his feet as he stepped out onto the beach. He regretted not putting on his shoes. He felt like a traveler between worlds. Barefoot he went, like the unjust dead, denied the gifts of the linden tree, forced to cross the thorns and wade the irons without them. As he grew closer, he could see that the two masts were those of his ship and Alfer's ship. Hrafn had said that all were present and accounted for, yet Ger's ship was nowhere in sight. Alfer's was anchored about 10 meters off the shore. His own ship was visible to him in full profile and raised upon a wooden cradle on the beach, presumably being inspected for damage. He could hear familiar voices coming from the far side of the vessel. His feet were burning now from the hot sand. As he walked, he kept his eyes on the dark sand ahead and ignored the pain. Finally, stepping onto the cool, wet sand, he paused a moment to quench his feet from the fire. The voices on the other side stopped speaking. 3 men, Ger, Haldor, and Ivar, came around the ship to see who had approached them. All 3 faces went blank at once. They stood dumbfounded. "Do you think me a ghost?" he asked. They had not thought him a ghost, but they had, at first glance, struggled to recognize him. But upon hearing his voice they were assured. Their faces softened, and they summoned their courage to put on good cheer. He looked aged. The roots of his hair above his brow showed gray in the morning sun, and his face and body appeared weak. However, the effect on them soon wore off, and they told him everything that had happened after he had fallen into the sea, how they threw the anchor overboard, hoping to rescue him, and thus discovered the shallows. Then, assuming he was lost to the sea, they pulled it up again. They recalled for him how the ship had continued westward and was driven onto the beach by the wind, and how they spent that first night huddled around fires. They told him of the events of the next day, including how Ger saw his own ship on an unexpected course, and how Ivar and 2 others accompanied him to meet his ship, and how the compass had drawn Ger to where his body lay. "Yes," said Ivar, "and he scooped you up from the sand as easily as a bear scoops up a fish in a shallow pool, and we carried you back to camp." "A fitting description, I do not doubt," said Fisker. "He has always been as round as a late summer bear." "With a tunic 1 size too small," Ger said, poking fun at himself in an attempt to conceal his concern. "How you were named for the slender spear no one will ever understand," said Fisker. "Perhaps he should have been named Bjorn," added Haldor, "for the name Bjorn means bear." "Of course he is Bjorn," Fisker laughed. "Why did I not know it sooner?" Ger looked proud to be called Bjorn. The name suited him, and he was glad to receive it. In time he would be known only as Bjorn, and the name Ger would become forgotten to all but a few. Fisker began to inspect his ship upon the cradle. "Your ship is whole," said Ger, "and nothing has been lost," he added, moving his head ever so slightly towards Fisker with a discreet nod. A worry left Fisker's face. "The shipwright has carved you a new steering oar," Ivar said. "We have laid it on the deck." "I shall make a new withy for it," Fisker said, and set it in its rightful place. "We have other work to attend to, so we shall leave the telling of the rest of the tale to Ger," Haldor said, and he and Ivar headed back to the camps. Ger told Fisker that after bringing him back to camp, they had first returned to the spot where they found him to retrieve the compass, but it was nowhere to be found, so they continued on to find where Ger's ship had gone. "And where did it go?" asked Fisker. "You shall soon see," said Ger. As they walked, Ger told him about the wild game they had seen here, and how they had already killed a stag and a boar. He told him of the copper deposits they had found, and tin as well, of proper wood for building homes and ships, of mushrooms and wild carrots and onions. Ger feared his excitement would wear on Fisker. Though he was up and walking, he did so slowly, and he did not look entirely well. They walked quietly on through the woods. Soon the mast of Ger's ship was seen between the trees, and shortly thereafter they were standing on the shores of a bay. The curving coastline that Haldor had piloted Ger's ship toward was the inlet to this bay. Haldor had reported that they had noticed it after spotting the other ships on the shore. Although they were still some distance out to sea, they could see the inlet and headed straight for it to investigate. As you will recall, Alvis instructed Haldor to take the ship east, and so they landed on the coast of the island they had been following before it disappeared from view. This, of course, is the reason Ger's ship arrived after the others. Haldor had later explained to Ger that he had heard the melody of the horn, but only faintly. It was not until after they had gone to the eastern island to take shelter from the storm that Haldor had learned the meaning of the melody. Arn, the man at the prow, had heard it and understood its meaning. He tried to tell Haldor they should go west, but he was not heard over the storm. When Arn realized they were headed for the safety of the island, he did not try any further to explain the horn's meaning to Haldor. In truth, he disliked the sea, and the terrible storm had him in fear for his life. Once they were safe on shore, however, he felt a tremendous guilt, and he told Haldor what he thought the horn's meaning was, but he covered up his cowardice by acting as if it had only just occurred to him, and no one was the wiser. With passengers and crew on solid ground, they removed everything from the ship, including the mast and sail, and turned the ship upside down to drain the water from the hull. There was nothing unusual in this, as their ships were light and could be carried over land in times of need. They then propped up one side of the ship with some of the remaining deck planking, and used it as a shelter against the storm. When the rain had subsided, everything was set back in place, and they headed west in search of the others.
"We suffered only minor injuries," Ger said, "and lost nothing save for you and the oar."
They stood silently for a while, Ger looking at Fisker, and Fisker looking at Ger's ship anchored in the bay. It was Fisker who broke the silence. "It was foolish of me to tempt fate. I wanted the search to be over, to finally find a place for her." Ger knew that Liv had asked Fisker to take her ashes with him to the new land. She would never see the house that he would build, nor feel the warmth of its hearth. She would never hear his hammer upon the anvil as he worked in his shop, or hear the laughter of their children. The loss of these things and other dreams brought her great sorrow. She made him promise that he would not leave her behind. The promise weighed heavily on my heart, and I feared that we would fail to find a place, and our people would grow tired and unwilling to continue searching. When I entered the water, my body gave up, and I lost my will. The weight carried me down to the ocean floor, and although her ashes were aboard my ship, I was willing to stay there beneath the waves and forget the promise. He looked away from Ger and off into the distance. She has been gone for over a year now, yet a memory of her gave me the strength to rise again from death. I would not be standing here now if not for her. Yet having to be here without her... He said no more. He began to walk around the bay, and Ger followed him. Fisker watched and listened to the land. He saw the tall, straight trees and heard the wind that whispered through and swayed them. He saw sandstone, limestone, shale, and slate, good for building. He found berry bushes growing in a glade. He saw many fish below the surface of the water, and he saw reeds along the water's edge, edible and useful for making baskets. He heard the gulls overhead and the bellowing of a distant stag.
"Well," Ger asked him at last, "what say you? Have we found a home?"
Fisker looked around where he stood, then across the bay. His eyes followed the inlet out to the sea and back again, and he felt a sudden smile on his lips. He felt it so intensely that it seemed as if he could somehow see it on his own face. "Yes," he said, "we have indeed found it." The two friends continued to walk alone together through the woods all around the bay, keeping it always in their sight.
My mother told me someday I will buy galleys with good oars and sails to distant shores.
When I began this video, I said the story would lead us back to the inn, but the story never mentioned the inn, because at that point it hadn't been built yet. What you're seeing now is what stood here first. The inn didn't begin as an inn. Ylva and Hrafn weren't members of either clan. While others built smaller shelters for the coming winter, they began something larger. The longhouse was raised on the far side of the bay, apart from where the others were building. With help from both clans, the longhouse was finished as the first hard frost set in. Seasons passed, fields were cleared, buildings rose, and ships came and went. The longhouse became the central gathering place of the growing village. For years, Ger and Fisker sought Ylva and Hrafn's counsel in important matters, and then, without a word, they were gone. Their hearth was found cold, their belongings left behind. No explanation was given, and no trace of them was ever found. The village endured, trade increased, and travelers came in greater number. What had begun as a gathering hall became a place of lodging, and in time, Arn set his hand to the old hall. He did not tear it down, but added to it, raising new walls beside the old. And that is how the Wolf and Raven Inn came to stand as it does today. The part of the inn that I built first is the part that came last for the people of Merchant Bay. By making a longhouse its beginning, I was able to anchor the inn in a traditional Viking style of building and give it a historical foundation. I could have simply added a longhouse to the existing structure and called it done, but a random longhouse has little meaning, and by then it was already too late. The decision to build it required an explanation, and that explanation became a story. I didn't know that the story would grow to 10,000 words. I knew nothing of Ger and Fisker, nothing of Fisker's promise, nothing of Ylva and Hrafn, their compass and horn, nor of their disappearance. I didn't even know they existed, nor did I know of the storm, or of Arn's cowardice aboard Ger's ship, of his regret, or of his resolve to transform the longhouse and ensure it endured as the village grew. I didn't know when I began that this video would take 2 years to finish, but once it had begun, I knew I would see it through. Ylva and Hrafn and the longhouse built on neutral ground set in motion events that would one day unite the Red and the White into a single clan. You will learn more about that and other events of Merchant Bay in future episodes. Meet me back here at the end next time, and we'll build something new. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tick the notification bell so you won't miss the next episode of Haldor's Merchant Bay Village.